Welcome, welcome. Your Tuesday Tea-ology is here. An afternoon Tea-ology today, but that's just fine. You need your cup of Glengettie Welsh brew tea in the afternoon, just as you need your Scottish breakfast tea in the morning. Gotta keep you going, keep you going. And of course, any time is a good time for theology. And we have been talking about the doctrine of creation, the works of God in the world that He has made, and never lose sight of what His creation says about Himself, that in what He has made, material and immaterial, whether stones and oceans and stars, or mankind and the unseen spiritual beings, angels, and whatnot, that in all of these things, the wisdom and power of God, His goodness and His infinite greatness are displayed. And as we've been turning our minds to the spiritual world, the unseen creation, and we've talked about angels and demons and so on for a few weeks now, and I think this will be the last on that before we move from creation into the unfolding drama of redemption, which of course begins with the fall. One more week, I think, to round out the unseen spiritual beings, touching on a couple of particular uh, things mentioned in the scriptures, but which uh, which raise questions. How are these related to, just as we speak of angels and so on? And so I want to talk particularly about uh, seraphim and cherubim today. Angelic beings mentioned in the Bible. And so there may be others that you can point to, and sometimes these things are unclear. So, for example, in the book of Revelation in chapter 4, and that is where we take a good amount of our understanding of some of these spiritual beings from, is these visions that God gives of heavenly throne room visions, as they are described. One scholar calls Revelation 4 something like the epitome of all of the throne room visions of the Bible. And there we read of a group of 24 elders seated around the throne, and their identity is never really gotten into, and people can dispute, are these humans, or are these angelic beings referred to as these elders? But that's one we've so little to go on. We won't follow that. But there are two others, at least, groups mentioned of beings, seraphim and cherubim. And I want to just offer some reflections on what the Bible says about the seraphim and cherubim, and what we maybe can conclude from that, and also keep our eye on the big picture of what all of this means to us, because once again, we only know these things because God has revealed them, so God wants us to know them, and to know what we are given to know about them. But at the same time, God has only revealed a little bit about these things, and so we are not invited to ceaseless speculation, which ends up being unfruitful for our lives. So to begin with seraphim, which I begin with not because they're the first mentioned, the cherubim are mentioned first, but because there is so little, comparatively, said about them. Seraphim are only mentioned by that title in Isaiah chapter 6. And so that is one of the heavenly throne room visions given to the prophet Isaiah. It's a wonderful, powerful verse. It just has this majesty as it comes. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. So we don't want to lose sight. This is not a passage about the seraphim. The seraphim are just a piece in a passage that is about the majesty and supremacy, sovereignty, holiness, glory of God. And in verse 2 it says, above him stood the seraphim. So their presence is particularly attendant to the presence of God in his exalted and throned place in this vision. And we don't get a detailed description. We get a picture. I was reading one scholar say that they appear to be human, and I don't know if that is specifically expressed, but there is no particular description of them, so that maybe is implied. But what's key about them is that they have 6 wings. So, your typical portrayal of an angel, popular cultural portrayal of an angel, again, is a winged woman, usually. And that's strange, unfortunate, because the humanoid portrayals of angels seem to be portraying them as men. I'm not saying that angels are male, just that that's how they seem to manifest. But they don't usually there's nothing said about wings. But in the case of the seraphim, we do see that. In fact, we see 6 wings. So they got these 3 pairs of wings. With 2, he covered his face. With 2, he covered his feet. And with 2, he flew. So these wings are not all useful for ordinary wingy things. There is flight, but there is also this sense of covering, and that lends its impression to the majesty of the picture. Here's God on his throne, and his attendants cover their faces and feet. And they seem to be associated particularly with praise to God. And that name of seraphim is obscure. We're not sure what it means. It might be related to fire, and so the idea of the burning majesty of God and of his holiness and so on. So there's really very little said about the seraphim. But when you go to Revelation chapter 4, to that picture of the heavenly throne, which clearly has, some things listed that remind us a lot of the picture in Isaiah of these visions that God is giving. Of course, there's going to be a connections between them. And in here, the throne is surrounded by 4 living creatures who are full of eyes in front and behind. The first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with the face of a man, and the fourth living creature like an eagle in flight. And each of them has 6 wings. So these creatures, they surround the throne like the seraphim did. They had 6 wings like the seraphim. Are we meant to understand, is it a mistaken assumption to think that the seraphim are human in appearance? Or are these the same creatures being described? Do they appear in 2 different ways in the visions? Again, remember, these are spiritual beings, and so the visions are putting things in a way we can see. They're not a part of our physics, as it were. Or are these different? Are the 4 living creatures and the seraphim different beings? So there's several possibilities. But now let's muddy the waters by turning now to the cherubim. And you may not realize this because you may not think about the cherubim and seraphim at all. By the way, that im at the end is just a more Hebrew way of making the plural. So you may say cherubs or seraphs, and that's anglicizing it, but the Hebrew plural ending is the im ending. So seraph and seraphim, cherub and cherubim. And you may not think about them at all. If you do, you may just say, well, these are just different creatures, and not realize that the cherubim are mentioned a whole lot throughout the Old Testament. I mean, not everywhere, but comparatively to the seraphim, who are in one passage, the cherubim are mentioned in various passages in various books. Mentioned very early on, when mankind is cast out of the garden, there are cherubim and a flaming sword put to guard the way to the tree of life. So the first thing we hear about them is not a description of them, but of their task. In this case, it is a military task as guards to keep mankind from transgressing, returning to the tree of life. A task which, of course, presumably was ended at the time of the flood or earlier, and the removal of the garden. And so that's the first mention. And then we see them in the giving of the covenant, when God establishes his relationship with Israel. The cherubim are to be sculpted onto the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. And then they're involved in the symbolism. They're embroidered on the curtains of the tabernacle. When Solomon builds the temple, he makes sculptures of cherubim to go in the Holy of Holies, and they are sculptured onto the walls of the temple. And so they have a strong connection with the presence of God. And their place on the tabernacle gives them the impression of being his throne attendants or throne bearers or something. In fact, in David, it refers there are places where there's a reference to God, various references to God as the one who sits enthroned on the cherubim. And so their position sort of as his throne bearers is established in the Old Testament. And in the chief description of the cherubim, so we have a lot of references to the cherubim, and you're reading it that they sculpted cherubim and they carved cherubim into the walls and so on, and you're saying, what did it look like? The major description of the cherubim comes from the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel also has a vision of the Lord enthroned. There are at least, so how many visions, heavenly throne visions are there in the Bible? There's one in Daniel. There's a very brief description in Exodus. There's one in Isaiah. There's the one in Ezekiel, and in Revelation. If there's any more, they're not coming to my mind. At least 5. These angelic creatures feature strongly in some of them, at least. And in Ezekiel chapter 1, we read there's another very powerful, remarkable, and startling vision. Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 4, as I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire as it were gleaming metal. And from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures. And this was their appearance. They had a human likeness, but each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Under their wings and on their 4 sides they had human hands. And the 4 had their faces and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another. Each one of them went straight forward without turning as they went. As for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. The 4 had the face of a lion on the right side, the 4 had the face of an ox on the left side, and the 4 had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces, and their wings spread out above. Each creature had 2 wings, each of which touched the wings of another, while 2 covered their bodies. And each went straight forward. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, without turning as they went. And so this is the setting, and they are sort of, once again, we have a picture of bearers of the throne above. You come to the end of later on in the chapter, and there's an expanse over their heads. It was like the expanse likeness of a throne in appearance like sapphire, and seated the likeness of a throne was a likeness with a human appearance, and this is the presence of the Lord. And so they are bearers of the heavenly throne in this vision, as in the images. And once again we see human and yet not. And so there's a lot of connections here. They have 4 wings, not 6, but once again the wings are up in a sort of flying motion, even though their movement is different than strictly flying, but also used for covering. The use of the wings as a covering there in the presence of God. They have these wheels associated with them, and some have regarded the wheels as representing angelic creatures. Angelic creatures they're referred to as the Ophanim. But I think that the connection between the cherubim and the wheels suggests a stronger connection than that. It refers to later in Ezekiel chapter 1 that the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. So we have these living creatures. Why do I say these are the cherubim? Well, in Ezekiel chapter 10, he clarifies that these are the cherubim. And yet the description, there is a tension in the description. Here we are in Ezekiel 1, and they're described as having 4 faces. Interestingly, the 4 faces match the 4 living creatures in the book of Revelation. But in Ezekiel chapter 41, Ezekiel chapter 41, we have a description. Ezekiel's describing a prophetic vision of the temple, and here it is decorated with cherubim, and he's very clear these cherubim have two faces, the human face and face of a lion. The face of an eagle or an ox aren't mentioned. Maybe they're just not in the picture, but maybe they're different. And all of this, my goodness, you feel like you're drinking out of a fire hose today. All of this detail and confusion. But maybe one possibility is, are cherubim and seraphim different names for the same creatures? They seem to fulfill the same role. There seems to be a connection between the many eyes and the wings. The details are different, and yet there is so much overlap. Now, maybe the details are different because these are different creatures, and some are shown in some visions and some are shown in others. Maybe the details are different because the same sort of spiritual attendants are being described under different names and with different emphases in their features. There is so much mystery here that we can't draw. And since they have different names, it's probably best to keep them somewhat different in our mind, and yet to recognize that these symbols, I say symbols not because we're not talking about real spiritual creatures, but because, again, they're immaterial, and so they're communicated to us by these visions, which bring a symbolism into the whole matter. That these symbols are drawing us to realities outside of what we ordinarily can comprehend and what is a part of our ordinary life. And the payoff in all of this, if you're drowning in the details, try to grasp the payoff in all of this is a reminder. These are God's creatures. They exist to glorify Him. And when we see them in these tasks of guarding or these tasks of representing the presence of God, they are pointing to the glory of the Creator, their majesty and splendor, and the wonder of the many eyes representing this idea of sight and of the covering of the self and the pointing to the holiness of God. All of these things build a picture of the majestic God who has created the multiplicity of creatures, others of them cherubim, seraphim, and who knows what else that we are not normally given to see, and yet are God's creatures which testify to His greatness. God is utterly beyond us, and He has reached down to us, and all things through when you are redeemed, all of those who receive the redemption that is in Jesus Christ then come to join with the angels and cherubim and seraphim in praise to the God who has made us and loved us and reached down to us and who is infinitely worthy of all worship and praise. So there's a little effort to tie together the wonderful mystery of God's creation and what He has done. And if it confuses you, if it overwhelms you, let it be an overwhelming that draws you to glorify the wondrous Creator. May the Lord bless you as you go through your day.